So there's this stat floating around right now that keeps showing up in my feed. And honestly, at first I, scrolled past it because it sounded like the kind of thing that people post when they get really angry at something. And the claim was that the minimum wage would need to be around $66 an hour to match the buying power of workers, that were, in the baby boomer era. $66 an hour. And every time it gets posted, half the comments are people saying, finally someone gets it. And the other half are basically just saying, this is just completely made up. And here's the thing. I think both sides are kind of missing a more interesting conversation here. Because when I actually sat down and looked at the numbers underneath the headline, I found a ratio that bothered me significantly more. Here is where it gets even, stranger. In 1970, the median home price in the US was around $27,000. Average household income that same year was roughly $10,000. So if you, do the math, a home costs about 2.7 times what a household income earned that year. So let's just call that 3-to-1 ratio roughly. That's the world that boomers brought their first houses in. Now jump to today, median home prices is hovering around $500,000. Median household income is somewhere between, $83,000 to $85,000 right now. That's a 6-to-1 ratio. So the number didn't just go up, the relationship between income and housing fundamentally changed. And the shift, this specific shift is quite enough that most people, feel it without being able to actually name that feeling. They just know that something feels harder than it's supposed to be. So what actually happened between then and now? Because this isn't just a normal inflation, just doing its thing. Prices go up, wages follow, everyone adjusts, and life continues. That's the story that all of us were sold. But housing stopped following that script a long time ago. At some point, houses stopped being just places, people live and started being investments that people hold on to. And once something becomes an investment, its price doesn't just track what regular people can afford anymore. It instead tracks what someone thinks they could sell it for, later. Those are two completely different things. So you ended up with this situation where people just trying to buy a place to raise a family are, competing against people who are trying to grow, a portfolio. And one of those groups has a lot more money than the other one. But here's something that I keep just turning over in my head, and I haven't necessarily fully resolved it yet. But if the ratio shifted from, 3x to 6x, that means households today would need roughly around $170,000 in income, not $84,000. And this is just to have the same relative position as households in the 1970s. I'm not talking about richer, not more comfortable, just the same. That's a, $80,000 to $90,000 gap that, exists before you account for anything like healthcare costs, student debt, and before the fact that most jobs stopped coming with pensions somewhere in the 1980s. So look, when younger people say that they're working harder just to stay in place, they're not being dramatic at all. The math actually supports that feeling. And what I'm still not sure about is whether people actually understand if it's, a structural problem and not a personal failure, because those two things require very different responses. And then there's this other side of the coin that I almost don't want to include because it's the part that makes people defensive. Look, the average American home in 1970 was roughly around 1,000 to 1,200 square feet. There was no central air in most of them. There was one phone per household, which was hardwired into a wall. There was also one TV, and cars existed purely to move from point A to point B. Nobody was leasing a $700 to $1,000 a month vehicle. And almost all meals came out of kitchens, not apps. There was also no subscription services that, quietly bled out, a checking account. So the question that I keep sitting with is this: how much of the financial pressure that people feel today is the system actually failing them, and how much of it is actually just normal, just got way too expensive without anyone actually agreeing to it. What I think is actually happening, and this is where it gets, kind of a little uncomfortable, is that there are two separate inflations running at the same time. And they get collapsed into one conversation when they're technically really doing two different things. The first one is structural. This is housing, healthcare, and education. The foundational things that anchor a life. Those things have definitely outpaced income growth by a significant margin. And that's not just a lifestyle choice, that's a system problem. Now, the second one is behavioral. Streaming, phone upgrades, food delivery, premium gym memberships, and just the pressure to signal a lifestyle across, all platforms in real time. That's the inflation of expectation. And the tricky part is that, they feel, kind of identical from the inside. The stress of not being able to afford a down payment and the stress of quietly overspending on things that you don't consciously choose, both actually register as financial pressures, but they have completely different solutions. There is another shift in here that I think gets buried, and it's what debt actually is now compared to what it used to be. In the boomer era, debt was largely just a tool. You borrowed to buy a home that would appreciate. You borrowed to build a business, and you use leverage strategically because, the underlying asset technically justified it. But at some point, debt shifted from being a lever into being a gap filler. People aren't necessarily just borrowing to build something anymore. They're borrowing to maintain a standard of living that their income technically can't support. I'm talking about credit cards covering, groceries, buy now, pay later for things that depreciate the second that they actually, ship to your house. And obviously student loans for degrees that don't move the needle, specifically the income needle. So the debt didn't change in form, but its function changed completely. And that shift in function is why so many people feel like they're moving but not going anywhere. Because the debt itself isn't creating leverage, it's just delaying pressure. So when someone posts that $66 an hour figure, what they're actually reacting to, even if they can't put words to it, is everything that we just talked about. The home price ratio that quietly doubled over the past 40, 50 years or so. The decade where wages, didn't grow at the same rate. And the way debt slowly stopped being a tool and started being a lifeline. I guess also the lifestyle expectations that crept up in every direction while the big costs were already climbing. Look, none of these happened in one obvious moment. It just built up over time. And the frustrating thing about problems that build, up slowly is that there's no single thing to point at. There's not one person to blame. And there's not, unfortunately, a quick fix that could make it right. Every solution that you hear, build more housing, raise wages, fix student loans, all of it takes years to move. And most people are dealing with this right now, not in 10 years. Here's what I keep coming back to. And I'm not saying this to be motivational because I genuinely find motivation content kind of, at this point exhausting. But the people who seem to be navigating this well aren't the ones who figured out some secret that the system doesn't want you to know. They're the ones who got unusually clear about which pressures are structurals and which ones that they're, technically generating themselves. And then responded differently to each pressure. The structural stuff, you can't individually fix that, but you can position yourself, relative to it. Now, the behavioral stuff, the lifestyle creep, the debt that's functioning as a gap filler instead of a lever, that's actually in play. The hard part is that separating them requires sitting with a level of honesty about your own spending that most people, quite frankly, just prefer to avoid by staying angry at the system. Both things can be true at the same time. The game is definitely harder, and some of the moves that you're making aren't helping you win it. Thanks for watching.